come back to this at the end.
Yeah.
This issue that there's certain costs of having these women's
Right.
rights as a separate sort of category of human rights. We
So-
don't object, and we'll get to that,
Right.
but I think.
But is that what? But part of what this story is, and what you're going to see in the video, is a bunch of women's activists saying we want to be part of the human rights system.
Right. Can I just put for our class and for everybody in general? You know, we've tried to be not very doctrinal
Right.
about what counts for human rights
Right.
and what doesn't. The law obviously does, and I'm trying to see this course. We said the history, theory, and practice of human rights. Part is about the practice. There is actually kind of an anthropological sense of what counts as human rights.
Right.
And people, these women, you'll see in the movies, we want to be part of this
Right.
for legal reasons, for social reasons,
For
cultural
rhetorical,
reasons, for
ideological.
rhetorical reasons,
Yeah.
for all sorts of reasons. You know, but I think the kind of issue Lars raises, which is having a separate women's rights category under human rights, does have consequences.
And what's interesting is that we have now a both and situation. The way the UN, and for now we'll just talk about the United Nations, the way the UN set up women, 1945 there was a commission on women and there was a commission on human rights. Okay? That's how the UN set it up. Then they also created, as different treaties got drafted, there were Civil and Political Covenant, Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights Covenant, Race Discrimination, Women Discrimination Against Women. The Treaty on Discrimination Against Women has the same power as the race discrimination, as the Civil and Political Covenant, but under the UN system, it was attached to a secretariat that was separate from all the other human rights treaties. So for 30 years, if you reported under CEDAW, the convention that I think you were asking about earlier, or maybe the guy next to you was, yeah, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, up until basically 1999, if you reported under that treaty, you went to a different secretariat, you had different flows of money, totally, and even though formally it was part of the human rights system, it was marginalized. Starting in 1999, the UN said, we're going to take that treaty and move it to where all the other human rights treaties meet. Same secretariat, same flow of money, same staffing, and all the other human rights treaties, the race discrimination, the child rights, the civil and political, should care about sex discrimination. They all had it written in their text, but they never did because you went to women. So starting in the 2000s, the treaties that just were based civil and political rights now do a lot of the most important women's rights work in the Civil and Political Covenant.
The quote I gave at the beginning,
Right.
Ali pointed out, was from UNICEF.
Development Entity for Children. Why is UNICEF doing some of the best economic rights documentation on women? UNICEF started taking up women's rights in the early mid-1990s because they figured out that women who had their rights took better care of kids and their rights.
And now that's changed because now there's a new reportage structure in there.
Now the UN has, and for better or for worse, I said it's a both-and situation. The Women's Convention, CEDAW, now sits with all the other treaty bodies, and the Human Rights Commission takes gender discrimination practice concerns all the time. But the Women's Commission still exists. What's it good for? Good question. And even though we've quote-unquote mainstreamed, and this is the fast forward to the end, all through the UN, the languages of gender mainstreaming. Gender mainstreaming is a nightmare when you don't have a real political commitment to deal with gender within your structure. So if you mainstream gender into UNDP, what it means is they tend to create a separate little entity in the UN Development Program that deals with women. Rather than for every development program, how does it affect the relations between men and women and people of many different genders, like asking real gender analysis questions, you still have a plunk of women inside this gender. So we have a both and. But the goal of the activists that we're going to be seeing in the movie was to move out of women's rights in a silo and put women's rights squarely in the center of the human rights system.
I think we'll get to some of these questions as we go along. But
right.
The last thing on this, before we move to the more general question, is one you've already answered a little bit, but we can talk about again in the current context, which is the divisions of the human rights community, both along gender and geographical lines of these female genital mutilation, and more generally these issues we read about, the honor killing and so forth. In other words, where does it stand now as a Western imposition versus indigenous? That's number one. And the second thing, I know in Europe this is a big issue in immigration law. In other words, France has forbidden female genital mutilation amongst immigrants in France. It's a criminal act. And immigration lawyers in France at work, it's not a criminal act, it's a private familial act. So could you say a little bit about both of those? Its
Well,
relationship to the modern women, international women's movements, and secondly, the migration question.
Well, I think the two questions are deeply intertwined.
That's why we had them under B.
Wherever they were, yeah. Because part of the story of FGM as a women's rights issue becomes decontextualized from all of the questions around post-colonial politics and who's struggling for power within the countries where FGM happens. And so there was a concern by a lot of women's groups in the countries that were affected by FGC, FGM, that they needed to do their politics locally first before Amnesty, we talked about this, Amnesty or Human Rights Watch dropped a report and asked the state, which nobody trusts, right? I mean, this is the other part, and Donna Sullivan makes this point in the article we read. When you call on the state to fix something within private family or community life, you are asking an entity to intervene with criminal powers, much of the time, into a community that may not trust that state and have really good reason for not trusting it. So within lots of different immigrants' rights communities across the world, the notion that police should take seriously domestic violence happening in immigrant communities was a double-edged sword. Yes, state takes violence against marginalized women seriously, but yes, state goes in, arrests, deports, sends whole families home. What's the better result? How do you deal? Because the critique, and this is where Ratna Kapoor's article comes in, call on the state and link criminal response as the only or best state response in marginalized communities who are struggling against forms of racism, struggling against the fact that they aren't full citizens in the countries where they appear. Is that true accountability, or is that just another tool for the state to regulate, marginalize, and expel those already marginalized communities, calling it saving women's rights? So that has really, and within France, as I understand it, the kind of use of French prosecutors to respond to some combination of both female genital cutting, questions of all kind of violence within the home has really divided the women's communities and the immigrants' rights communities in figuring out what's the right response under French law, especially given the way that French law is moving to like re-Francify itself and make everyone non-authentic.
So it's a big political, I guess the conclusion of this section, there is no yes and no. It's an ongoing political.
And I think that the message for many of us is notice what issues arise at what period of history. And don't take literally that it's simply the atrocity that it's moving the politics around that human rights
issue. And can I just point out,
I think we have a hand in the back.
And Ali's class might want to read the Tabitha Kanogo piece,
right,
because that's an issue amongst African women communities, leaving aside the missionaries in the 20th century. Right. So we cut the Peterson piece for you guys, but we still read the Kanogo piece because we want you to see this is not just a missionary problem. This is an issue. It comes in all these colonial situations. The relationship of the domestic world to the colonial state divided communities because there were women who wanted the help of the colonial state, and there were women who didn't want the help of the colonial state. And those are really important divides. And so that's why I was hoping you'd see this in different registers.
There's a question back there. Mm-hmm. Here's the question. How necessary was this Velázquez-Rodriguez decision to have happened in the inter-American system? I mean, what was extremely necessary was for an authoritative court at the international levels, and regional courts are international courts, to have established this legal doctrine. Because otherwise, it was us within human rights organizations pushing a legal doctrine that had not yet been fully codified. We needed someone, European Court, UN Human Rights Committee, Inter-American Court, doesn't matter. But it turned out, as a matter of fact, the Inter-American system did it first, in part because, and this is the little secret that we talked a little about in class, the court was suspicious that, in fact, the government really had been behind the disappearance, and they didn't want to let the government off the hook. So politically, they drove a doctrine into the field of human rights based on a political suspicion. And then that legal doctrine state responsible for non-state actor is cut free from those initial political concerns. Okay? But it was important that we had a court, because one of the things about human rights activism is that we struggle